A new adventure in London. Pedro is a young man from Spain. He is 22 years old. Pedro lives in Madrid with his family. He has a mother, a father, and a sister. Pedro likes his life in Madrid, but he wants more. He wants to learn English and see the world. One day, Pedro has an idea. He thinks, I want to go to London. London is a big city in England. Many people speak English there. Pedro is excited. He tells his family about his plan. I want to go to London to learn English, Pedro says to his parents. His mother looks worried. But Pedro, London is far away, she says. His father nods. Yes, and it's expensive, he adds. Pedro understands their concerns. But he really wants to go. He says, I will work hard and save money. I can do this. Pedro's sister, Anna, smiles. That's great, Pedro. You will learn so much, she says. For 6 months, Pedro works very hard. He works at a cafe in the morning. He teaches Spanish to children in the afternoon. Every day, he puts some money in a box. The box is for his London trip. Finally, Pedro has enough money. He buys a plane ticket to London. He also finds a small room to rent in London. Pedro is very happy and excited. The day of the trip arrives. Pedro goes to the airport with his family. His mother hugs him tightly. Be careful, my son, she says. His father pats him on the back. We are proud of you, Pedro, he says. Anna gives Pedro a small gift. Open it when you're in London, she tells him. Pedro waves goodbye and boards the plane. He feels nervous but also very excited. After 2 hours, the plane lands in London. Pedro looks out the window. He sees a big, busy airport. There are people from many different countries. Pedro hears many languages. He thinks, wow, London is really multicultural. Pedro takes a bus from the airport to the city center. He looks at everything with wide eyes. The buildings are different from Madrid. The cars drive on the left side of the road. This is new for Pedro. The bus stops. Pedro gets off with his bags. He looks at a piece of paper in his hand. On it is the address of his new home. Pedro needs to find this place. He looks around. There are many people walking fast. Pedro feels a little lost. He decides to ask for help. Pedro sees a friendly-looking woman. He goes to her and says, "Excuse me. Can you help me, please?" The woman smiles. "Of course," she says. "What do you need?" Pedro shows her the address. "I need to find this place," he says slowly. The woman looks at the paper. "Oh, that's not far," she says. "Go straight ahead. Then turn right at the big red building. The street you want is the second left." Pedro listens carefully. He repeats the directions to make sure he understands. "Thank you very much," he says to the woman. "You're welcome," she replies. "Welcome to London." Pedro follows the directions. He finds the street easily. Then he looks for the house number. Finally, he sees it. It's an old house with a blue door. Pedro rings the doorbell. An old lady opens the door. She has gray hair and a kind face. "Hello," she says. "You must be Pedro." "Yes, I am Pedro," he replies. "Nice to meet you." The lady's name is Mrs. Thompson. She shows Pedro to his room. It's small but clean and comfortable. There's a bed, a desk, and a wardrobe. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," Pedro says. He puts his bags down and sits on the bed. He feels tired but happy. Pedro remembers the gift from his sister. He opens it. Inside is a small book. It's an English phrase book. There's a note from Anna. It says, "To help you on your London adventure. Love, Anna." Pedro smiles. He opens the book and starts to read. He learns his first English phrase, "Nice to meet you." The next day, Pedro wakes up early. He's excited to explore London. He eats breakfast with Mrs. Thompson. She gives him a map of the city. "Where will you go today?" Mrs. Thompson asks. Pedro thinks for a moment. "I want to see Big Ben," he says. Mrs. Thompson nods. "Good choice. Big Ben is beautiful. Take the Underground to Westminster Station." Pedro looks confused. "Underground?" he asks. "Oh, sorry," Mrs. Thompson says. "The Underground is our subway system. We also call it the Tube." Pedro learns a new word, tube. He likes learning new words. Pedro leaves the house and walks to the nearest tube station. He looks at the map. It's complicated with many colored lines. Pedro feels a bit overwhelmed. A young man notices Pedro looking confused. He asks, "Do you need help?" Pedro nods. "Yes, please. I want to go to Westminster." The young man shows Pedro which ticket to buy and which train to take. "Just follow the signs for the Circle Line," he says. Pedro thanks him and follows his instructions. He gets on the right train. The train is full of people. Pedro hears many languages. He thinks, London is like a small world. After a few stops, Pedro arrives at Westminster Station. He goes up the stairs and comes out onto the street. He looks up and gasps. There it is, Big Ben. It's even bigger and more beautiful than in pictures. Pedro takes many photos. He sends some to his family in Madrid. Then he walks along the River Thames. He sees the London Eye, a huge Ferris wheel. Pedro decides to ride it. On the London Eye, Pedro can see all of London. It's amazing. He thinks, I'm so happy I came here. After his ride, Pedro is hungry. He sees a small cafe. Inside, he looks at the menu. There are many things he doesn't understand. The waiter comes to take his order. Pedro points to something on the menu. This, please, he says. The waiter nods. Fish and chips. Good choice. Pedro learns another new phrase, fish and chips. When his food comes, he enjoys it very much. As the days pass, Pedro starts to feel more comfortable in London. He learns to use the tube without help. He visits many famous places, Tower Bridge, Buckingham Palace, and the British Museum. Pedro also starts his English classes. On the first day, he's nervous. There are students from many countries in his class. The teacher, Mr. Brown, is very friendly. Hello, everyone, Mr. Brown says. Welcome to your English class. Let's start by introducing ourselves. One by one, the students say their names and where they're from. Pedro listens carefully. When it's his turn, he says, Hello. My name is Pedro. I'm from Spain. Mr. Brown smiles. Very good, Pedro. Welcome to London. In class, Pedro learns many new words and phrases. He practices speaking with his classmates. Sometimes it's hard, but Pedro doesn't give up. He knows that learning a new language takes time and practice. After class, Pedro often goes to a nearby park. He likes to sit on a bench and watch people. He sees families having picnics, friends playing football, and people walking their dogs. Pedro thinks about his family in Madrid. He misses them, but he's also happy to be in London. One day in the park, Pedro meets Maria. Maria is from Italy. She's also in London to learn English. They start talking and realize they have a lot in common. Do you like London? Maria asks Pedro. Pedro nods enthusiastically. Yes, I love it. It's so different from Madrid. What about you? Maria smiles. I love it too, but sometimes I miss Italian food. Pedro laughs. I know what you mean. I miss Spanish food too. From that day, Pedro and Maria become good friends. They often meet after class to practice English together. They visit museums, try new restaurants, and explore different parts of London. As weeks turn into months, Pedro's English improves a lot. He can now have simple conversations with people. He understands more when he watches English TV shows. Pedro feels proud of his progress. One evening, Pedro calls his family in Madrid. His mother answers the phone. "Hola, mamor," Pedro says. Then he switches to English. "How are you?" His mother laughs. "Oh, Pedro, your English sounds so good." Pedro smiles. He tells his family about his life in London. He talks about his classes, his new friends, and all the places he has visited. "We miss you," his mother says. "But we're so proud of you." Pedro feels happy. He misses his family too, but he knows he made the right decision to come to London. As Pedro's English gets better, he starts to notice more things about London. He realizes that there are many different accents and ways of speaking English. Some people speak very fast, while others speak more slowly. Pedro finds it interesting to listen to these differences. One day, Pedro decides to visit Camden Market. He's heard it's a great place to experience London's diverse culture. When he arrives, he's amazed by what he sees. There are stalls selling food from all over the world, colorful clothes, and unique crafts. Pedro wanders through the market, taking in all the sights, sounds, and smells. He stops at a food stall selling Indian curry. The smell is delicious, but Pedro isn't sure what to order. The man at the stall notices Pedro's hesitation. "First time trying curry?" he asks with a friendly smile. Pedro nods. "Yes, I've never had it before." "Well, you're in for a treat," the man says. He explains the different types of curry to Pedro, describing the flavors and spice levels. Pedro decides to try a mild chicken curry. As he eats, he chats with the stall owner. He learns that the man is originally from Mumbai and has been in London for 20 years. "That's what I love about London," the man says. "It's a place where people from all over the world come together." Pedro agrees. He's experiencing this diversity firsthand, and it's one of the things he loves most about the city. As Pedro continues to explore London, he starts to challenge himself more with his English. He decides to join a book club at the local library. At first, he's nervous about reading an entire book in English, but he's determined to try. The first book the club reads is The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, by Mark Haddon. Pedro finds it challenging but fascinating. He learns many new words and expressions. At the book club meeting, Pedro listens carefully as others discuss the book. He's a bit shy about speaking at first, but the other members are very encouraging. "What did you think of the main character, Christopher?" one of the members asks Pedro. Pedro takes a deep breath and tries to express his thoughts. "I think Christopher is very interesting," he begins slowly. "He sees the world in a different way. It made me think about how we all experience things differently." The other members nod and smile encouragingly. Pedro feels proud that he was able to share his opinion in English. As time goes on, Pedro's confidence grows. He starts to use English more in his daily life. He chats with the cashier at the supermarket, makes small talk with people at bus stops, and even tells jokes in English to his friends. One day, Pedro realizes that he's starting to think in English sometimes. It's a strange but exciting feeling. He mentions this to his teacher, Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown smiles. "That's a great sign, Pedro. It means you're really internalizing the language." Pedro feels proud of his progress, but he knows he still has a lot to learn. He decides to challenge himself even more. He signs up for a part-time job as a waiter in a small cafe. It's hard work, and sometimes customers speak too fast or use words he doesn't understand. But Pedro doesn't give up. He asks questions when he's not sure, and he learns new phrases every day. His favorite customer is an old man named George who comes to the cafe every morning for breakfast. George is patient with Pedro and often teaches him new English expressions. One morning, George says to Pedro, "It's raining cats and dogs out there." Pedro looks confused. "Cats and dogs?" he asks. George laughs and explains that it's an expression meaning it's raining very heavily. Pedro loves learning these colorful phrases that aren't in his textbooks. As Pedro becomes more comfortable with English, he starts to appreciate the nuances of the language. He notices how people use different words and phrases in different situations. He learns about formal and informal language, and when to use each. He also starts to understand British humor better. At first, he found it confusing when people used sarcasm or made understated comments. Now, he can usually tell when someone is joking, even if they say it with a straight face. Pedro's English improvement also helps him make more friends. He joins a local football team and enjoys playing matches on weekends. After games, the team often goes to a pub together. Pedro used to be quiet during these outings, but now he joins in the conversations and banter. One evening at the pub, Pedro's teammate Tom asks him, "So, Pedro, what do you miss most about Spain?" Pedro thinks for a moment. "The food, of course," he says with a laugh. "And my family. But you know, I feel like I have a second family here now." Tom raises his glass. "Cheers to that, mate," he says. Pedro feels a warmth in his chest. He realizes that London has become more than just a place to learn English. It's become a second home. As his time in London approaches the one-year mark, Pedro reflects on how much he's changed. He's not just better at English, he's more confident, more independent, and more open-minded. He decides to celebrate his London anniversary by doing something special. He invites his friends, both his classmates from the language school and his new English-speaking friends, to a party at his favorite park. Pedro prepares a mix of Spanish and British food for the picnic. He makes a big paella, but also brings fish and chips and scones with clotted cream and jam. As his friends gather in the park, Pedro looks around at the group. There's Maria from Italy, Yuki from Japan, Tom from his football team, Mrs. Thompson, his landlady, and many others. They're all chatting and laughing together, a mix of accents and cultures united by the shared experiences in London. Pedro stands up and clears his throat. Everyone turns to look at him. He feels a moment of nervousness, but then he begins to speak. "Thank you all for coming today," he says in clear, confident English. "A year ago, I came to London knowing only a few words of English. I was scared and unsure. But now, looking at all of you, I realize how much I've gained. Not just a new language, but new friends, new experiences, and a new perspective on the world." He raises his glass. "To London, to new beginnings, and to all of you. Cheers." Everyone cheers and claps. Pedro feels a sense of accomplishment and happiness wash over him. He knows that his journey is far from over, there's still so much to learn and experience. But he's excited for whatever comes next. As the sun sets over London, casting a golden glow over the park, Pedro looks at his friends laughing and talking. He thinks about how far he's come and how much he's grown. He remembers the nervous young man who arrived in London a year ago, and he smiles. London, with its diversity, its challenges, and its opportunities, has changed him. And Pedro knows that this is just the beginning of his adventure. As Pedro's second year in London begins, he finds himself facing new challenges and opportunities. His English has improved significantly, and he's now able to engage in more complex conversations and tasks. One day, Pedro receives an email from his university in Madrid. They're offering a study abroad program in partnership with a university in London. The program would allow Pedro to complete his degree while staying in London. It's an exciting opportunity, but it also means committing to staying in London for at least 2 more years. Pedro spends days mulling over the decision. He discusses it with his friends, his family back in Spain, and even his landlady, Mrs. Thompson. Everyone offers different perspectives, making the choice even more difficult. One evening, as Pedro is walking along the Thames, he bumps into his friend Tom. "You look lost in thought, mate," Tom says. "Everything all right?" Pedro sighs and explains his dilemma. Tom listens attentively, nodding along. "Sounds like a tough decision," Tom says when Pedro finishes. "But you know, sometimes the hardest choices are the ones most worth making. What does your gut tell you?" Pedro ponders this for a moment. "My gut tells me to stay," he admits. "I feel like I'm not done with London yet. There's still so much to learn, so much to experience." Tom grins and claps Pedro on the shoulder. "Well, there's your answer then, isn't it?" The next day, Pedro sends his acceptance email to the university. As he clicks send, he feels a mix of excitement and nervousness. He's committing to a longer stay in London, but he's also opening himself up to new possibilities. The university program proves to be challenging but rewarding. Pedro finds himself in lectures and seminars, discussing complex topics in English. At first, he struggles to keep up, often having to look up words and concepts after class. But gradually, he begins to hold his own in debates and discussions. One of Pedro's favorite classes is British literature. The professor, Dr. Amelia Wright, is passionate about the subject and encourages lively discussions in class. Pedro finds himself engrossed in the works of Shakespeare, Dickens, and Woolf. During a class discussion on Mrs. Dalloway, by Virginia Woolf, Dr. Wright asks Pedro for his interpretation of a particular passage. Pedro takes a deep breath before answering. "I think Woolf is exploring the concept of time here," he begins, his accent still noticeable but his words clear and thoughtful. The way she jumps between past and present mirrors how our minds work. We're constantly shifting between memories and the current moment. Dr. Wright nods approvingly. "Excellent analysis, Pedro. You've captured one of the key themes of the novel." Pedro feels a surge of pride. Not only has he understood a complex English novel, but he's also managed to express his thoughts about it eloquently. As Pedro delves deeper into his studies, he also becomes more involved in London's cultural scene. He starts attending theatre productions, not just the famous West End shows, but also small, experimental performances in tiny venues tucked away in the city's back streets. One evening, Pedro attends a modern adaptation of Hamlet at a small theatre in Shoreditch. The play is set in a dystopian future, with Hamlet as a rebel fighting against a totalitarian regime. Pedro is captivated by the performance, marveling at how the actors bring new life to Shakespeare's words. After the show, Pedro stays for a Q&A session with the cast and director. He listens intently as they discuss the creative process and the challenges of adapting Shakespeare for a modern audience. To his own surprise, Pedro finds himself raising his hand to ask a question. "I was fascinated by your interpretation of Ophelia," Pedro says to the actress who played the role. "In this version, she seemed much more empowered than in the original. Was that a conscious decision?" The actress smiles, clearly pleased by the question. "Absolutely," she replies. "We wanted to explore what Ophelia might be like if she had more agency. In our interpretation, She's not just a victim of circumstance, but an active participant in the rebellion. Pedro nods, thinking deeply about this new perspective on a character he thought he knew. As he leaves the theater, Pedro realizes how much his relationship with English has changed. It's no longer just a tool for basic communication, it's become a medium through which he can engage with complex ideas and nuanced art forms. This realization inspires Pedro to push himself even further. He starts writing a blog about his experiences as a Spanish student in London, sharing his insights on British culture, language learning, and the challenges of living abroad. To his surprise, the blog gains a following, particularly among other international students and expats in London. One of Pedro's posts, titled, "The London No One Tells You About," goes viral. In it, he writes about the hidden gems he's discovered in the city, the quiet bookshops, the community gardens, the local markets where you can find food from every corner of the world. He also touches on the less glamorous aspects of London life, the crowded tube during rush hour, the unpredictable weather, the high cost of living. The post resonates with many readers, and soon Pedro finds himself invited to speak at a conference for international students. The idea of public speaking in English terrifies him, but he decides to accept the challenge. On the day of the conference, Pedro stands nervously backstage, running through his speech in his head. As he's introduced and walks onto the stage, he sees a sea of faces looking up at him expectantly. He takes a deep breath and begins to speak. "When I first came to London," he starts, his voice shaky at first but growing stronger, "I thought I knew what to expect. Big Ben, red buses, fish and chips. But the London I've discovered over the past 2 years is so much more than that. It's a city of contrasts and contradictions, of challenges and opportunities." As Pedro continues his speech, he finds himself relaxing. He shares anecdotes about his early days in the city, the mistakes he made, the friends he's made. He talks about the joy of finally understanding a British joke, and the frustration of still sometimes feeling like an outsider. "But that's the beauty of London," he concludes. "It's a city that's constantly changing, constantly challenging you to grow and adapt. And in doing so, it changes you too." As Pedro finishes his speech, the audience erupts in applause. He stands there, slightly dazed, realizing that he's just given a 20-minute speech in English, something he couldn't have imagined doing when he first arrived in London. After the conference, several people approach Pedro to chat. One of them is a representative from a publishing company who's interested in turning Pedro's blog into a book. "Your perspective is unique," the representative says. "I think a lot of people would be interested in reading about your journey." Pedro is stunned by the offer. Writing a book in English seems like an enormous challenge, but also an incredible opportunity. He thinks about how far he's come from struggling to ask for directions to potentially becoming a published author in English. As Pedro walks home that evening, he reflects on his journey. He thinks about the nervous young man who arrived in London 2 years ago, barely able to string a sentence together in English. He thinks about all the challenges he's faced, all the moments of doubt and frustration. But he also thinks about all he's gained, the friends he's made, the experiences he's had, the person he's become. London has changed him in ways he never expected. It's challenged him, frustrated him, inspired him, and ultimately, it's helped him grow into a more confident, more open-minded version of himself. As he looks up at the London skyline, a mix of ancient buildings and modern skyscrapers, Pedro feels a sense of belonging. This city, with all its complexities and contradictions, has become his home. And he can't wait to see what the next chapter of his London story will bring. With the prospect of writing a book looming before him, Pedro embarks on a new challenge. He decides to take a creative writing course to hone his skills in English. The course is intensive, pushing Pedro to express himself in ways he never thought possible in his second language. During one of the classes, the instructor, Ms. Bennett, gives them a challenging assignment: write a short story that captures the essence of their experience in London, but do it entirely in the second person. Pedro stares at the blank page for a long time, unsure how to begin. Then, slowly, the words start to come. You arrive in London with a suitcase full of dreams and a heart full of fear. The city looms large around you, a labyrinth of possibilities and pitfalls. You fumble with unfamiliar coins at the newsagents, your tongue tripping over words you thought you knew. But day by day, the city begins to unfold before you like a well-worn map. As Pedro writes, he finds himself pouring his experiences onto the page. The story flows from him, capturing the excitement, the frustrations, the small victories, and the moments of profound change he's experienced. When he reads his story aloud in class, there's a moment of silence after he finishes. Then, Ms. Bennett smiles. "Pedro," she says, "I think you've found your voice." Encouraged by this success, Pedro throws himself into writing his book. He spends his evenings and weekends at his desk, typing away, occasionally pausing to gaze out at the London skyline for inspiration. As he writes, Pedro realizes that his book is becoming more than just a story about learning English or adapting to life in London. It's a story about personal growth, about pushing beyond comfort zones, about finding oneself in the midst of change. Months pass, and finally, Pedro types the last word of his manuscript. He sits back, exhausted but exhilarated. He's done it. He's written an entire book in English. The process of getting the book published is a new adventure in itself. Pedro learns about editing, book design, and marketing. He has to make decisions about cover art and back cover blurbs. It's stressful at times, but also exciting. Finally, after what seems like an eternity of waiting, Pedro holds the first printed copy of his book in his hands. The title, London Calling, A Spanish Heart in an English World, is embossed on the cover. Pedro runs his fingers over the letters, hardly able to believe that this is real. The book launch is held at a small bookshop in Notting Hill. As Pedro arrives, he's amazed to see a queue of people waiting outside. There are familiar faces: his friends, his classmates, his football teammates, but also many strangers who have read his blog or heard about his story. As Pedro begins his reading, he looks out at the audience and sees a sea of supportive faces. He sees Mrs. Thompson, beaming proudly from the front row. He sees Maria, who has become one of his closest friends. And to his surprise, he sees his family. His parents and sister have flown in from Madrid for the occasion. After the reading, as Pedro is signing books, a young woman approaches him. She looks nervous as she hands him her copy of the book. "Your blog inspired me to come to London," she says shyly. "I've only been here a month, but I already love it. Thank you for sharing your story." Pedro is deeply moved. He realizes that his journey has not only transformed his own life but has also touched the lives of others. As the evening winds down, Pedro's family gathers around him. His mother hugs him tightly. "We are so proud of you, mijo," she says, tears in her eyes. His father nods in agreement. "You've come so far," he says. "You're not the same Pedro who left Madrid 3 years ago." Pedro knows this is true. He's grown in ways he never imagined possible. He's not just fluent in English now, he's fluent in the language of London, in the rhythms and nuances of this vibrant, complex city. Later that night, Pedro stands on the balcony of his flat, looking out over the city he now calls home. The lights of London twinkle before him. each one representing a story, a dream, a possibility. He thinks about the nervous young man who arrived in London 3 years ago, barely able to ask for directions. He thinks about all the challenges he's faced, all the moments of doubt and frustration. But he also thinks about all he's gained, the friends he's made, the experiences he's had, the person he's become. London has changed him in ways he never expected. It's challenged him, frustrated him, inspired him, and ultimately, it's helped him grow into a more confident, more open-minded version of himself. As he looks at the London skyline, a mix of ancient buildings and modern skyscrapers, Pedro feels a deep sense of belonging. This city, with all its complexities and contradictions, has become his home. It's where he found his voice, both in English and in life. Pedro smiles to himself, thinking about what the future might hold. He knows there will be more challenges ahead, more opportunities to grow and learn. But now, he feels ready for whatever comes next. He takes a deep breath of the cool London air and makes a silent promise to himself. To keep exploring, keep learning, keep growing. Because that, he realizes, is what his London journey has truly been about. As he turns to go back inside, Pedro takes one last look at the city spread out before him. "Thank you, London," he whispers, his words carried away by the gentle night breeze. And with that, Pedro closes the balcony door, ready to begin the next chapter of his London story. The city has called, and he has answered. Whatever comes next, he knows he's where he's meant to be.